My thanks to the ranking members. In addition, let me take this opportunity also to thank the Joint Inquiry staff under the direction of Eleanor Hill for a difficult process that they've gone through, but one that has been very effective. Mr. Chairman, I'm convinced that these public hearings were created to explore what, if anything, went wrong in the days and the events that led up to September the 11th. I'm convinced that additional review is likely and probably needed, and that we will establish an independent commission to carry on the work of this joint inquiry and to review other agencies that were not the focus of this current inquiry. What's gone unmentioned until today, and I'd like to reinforce it, is how many times the system worked. Most members of this inquiry have spent time across this country and around the world.
It only worked when the operation was in the planning stages. Certain operations, the bigger ones, well, it didn't work. For example, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. They had intelligence to stop it. They had the necessary intelligence to stop it. And they actually had an informant inside the Brooklyn cell led by an Egyptian radical named Omar Abdel Rahman, who is the imam at the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn. And they pulled the informant out, and that was Imad Salem. They knew that they wanted to bomb US targets. What they didn't know was that they were going to bomb the World Trade Center. But if Imad Salem could have been in the group still, they could have arrested some of the people. After the bombing, Imad Salem came back, went back to being an informant, and there was another operation that was taking place, and that was called the Landmarks Plot. And they stopped that because they were making the bombs for that. Imad Salem was, and they arrested everybody involved. So the operations regarding the intelligence services, especially domestic, when it comes to the FBI, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think it fails more than it succeeds, if you ask me.
World, with our intelligence community and law enforcement individuals, inquiring about what they knew and when they knew it, but more importantly, what they needed. What we heard was crucial, I think, to this inquiry. But what we saw was invaluable to the American people. Members of our intelligence and law enforcement community working unthinkable hours in primitive surroundings without family or friends, things we all take for granted. I mention this to my colleagues because our focus shifted for the last 12 months to what happened. Their focus has been and continues to be on protecting the American people from the evil that exists globally. Though mistakes were made that contributed to the 9/11 attack, the men and women who work on the American people's behalf around the world do this with the resources and authorities that we supply. And let's not forget, they are the best in the world. As this committee, as this inquiry hands off the review to a commission, I hope we will, as members, refocus on what we can do to complement the dedication of so many around the world with the resources that fill the gaps that all of us know exist. And with having said that, Director Tenet, Director Mueller, let me ask you, 1 year later, in hindsight, what would you have done differently? Also recognizing the fact, Director Mueller, that you weren't in your capacity.
Wow,
but if
what
you...
a question, right? To ask Tenet of all people. Man, what would he have done differently? He would have shared the information regarding two hijackers that were living inside the United States to the FBI and to the State Department. He withheld that information from the FBI and the State Department for 16 months. And the excuse was, much later on given, was that nobody read the cable. But he lied. 53 case agents inside Alex Station and the counterterrorism unit had read the cable. And that's reinforced by Lawrence Wright in his book, The Looming Tower. And also to Mark Rossini, an FBI counterterrorism officer from New York City, the FBI counterterrorism office in New York City, on detail at Alex Station.
Will give us insight as to possibly where the Bureau should have changed earlier, if they should have. I'll turn to Director Tenet first.
I think that personally, when I think about this, the one thing that strikes me that we all just let pass from the scene after the Millennium Threat was this fellow who tried to cross the border from Canada into the United States.
Ahmed Wassam, they arrested him in British Columbia. He was going to be the person who would deliver the bomb to LAX International Airport, which was part of the Millennium Plot, which was a multifaceted operation constructed by a number of different groups, but it involved Al-Qaeda to an extent.
There were no attacks. There were no Americans killed. We didn't have any hearings. We didn't talk about failures. We didn't talk about accountability. We just assumed the system would keep working because it prevented the last attack. He tried to cross the border. And I think one of the things that everybody should have done is say, what does this mean more carefully, rather than just moving from this threat to the next threat, assuming it had been disrupted? What does it mean for the homeland? Should we have taken more proactive measures sooner? Hindsight is perfect, but it is the one event that sticks in my mind. Second, and again, hindsight is perfect. We should have taken down that sanctuary a lot sooner. The circumstances at the time may have not warranted, the regional situation may have been different. And after 9/11, all I can tell you is we let a sanctuary fester, we let him build capability. And there may have been lots of good reasons why in hindsight it couldn't have been done earlier or sooner. And I'm not challenging it because hindsight is always perfect, but we let them operate with impunity for a long time without putting the full force and muscle of the United States against them.
Now, well, I mean, come on, George. All right, there's some truth to this, right? Now, the CIA were the first agency to try to assassinate bin Laden in the Sudan. Well, bin Laden went to the Sudan in 1992 because he was house arrested in Saudi Arabia for fear of a backlash because the government refused his offer to use the Mujahideen or his Arab Mujahideen fighters against the Ba'athist army in Kuwait. And they house arrested him and froze his assets. He made a deal with the head of the General Intelligence Directorate, Prince Turki bin Faisal, through a backdoor deal that if he left Saudi Arabia and relocated to another country, they would give back his assets and he wouldn't be under house arrest any longer. And he took the deal and he went to the Sudan. Now, according to the story of Billy Waugh, Billy Waugh is a legend in Central Intelligence Agency, had a 40-year career. He actually was involved with the Tora Bora battle against bin Laden in 2001, and he was 72 years old. Well, actually, back in 1992, he said that he tracked the movements of bin Laden. Meanwhile, by the way, just to add, Billy Waugh also was responsible for the capture of Carlos de Jackal, along with Cofer Black, who was the CIA's counterterrorism chief. Anyway, Billy Waugh actually reported back to his handlers in the counterterrorism unit, and he said that he could basically assassinate bin Laden because he had a house in Khartoum and he used to take these daily routines to a mosque. every day, never changed his routine. And the Clinton administration said no. However, there were times where the CIA actually withheld information about bin Laden to the FBI over the years, many times. I know there's interagency fighting, but you withheld information which could have been provided useful information to the FBI about Al Qaeda operatives inside the United States. And you withheld that information. And you had a habit of doing that.
I just heard a discussion about, which one of my people is accountable. I need to tell you something. We've gone through this exercise about how many people and how do you count them. And the truth is, the people that have been working this are absolute heroes. And if I reflect back on my own responsibility, I tripled the size of CTC, quadrupled the budget. In hindsight, I wish I'd said, let's take the whole enterprise down and put 500 more people there sooner. I couldn't make that choice at the time because of all the other competing things I had to do that everybody would hold me responsible against failing for. But in hindsight, I wish we'd thrown more people at it in some way to give those people the relief because, the tempo and the pace and the exhaustion, notwithstanding the fact that on the watch list issue, procedures may have not been perfect. It's not an excuse. They were.
Talk about the watch list procedures. Let's go back to 1990. A known terrorist, Omar Abdel Rahman, he was on a global terrorist watch list. He actually applied for a U.S. visa in Cairo, Egypt. He was released from the Torah prison in Egypt. He was there for a couple of years because he was suspected of being behind the assassination of the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat. He actually is released from prison. He's he's persona non grata in Egypt, and he applies for a U.S. visa at a U.S. consular office in Cairo, Egypt. Meanwhile, there were case officers, CIA case officers, acting as U.S. consular agents who approved of Rahman's visa not once, not twice, but 3 times. And Rahman entered the United States while being on a global terrorist watch list. I find that ironic, Mr. Tenet, but then again, you work for the most disastrous agency in the world.
We're exhausted. There were never enough of them.
The biggest terrorist agency in the world. None bigger.
There were never enough of us, period, across the range of targets we cover. So I think about that as well. The other thing I would say to you, quite frankly, is there was never a systematic thought process to think about how you play defense. It comes back to the guy trying to cross the border. You can disseminate all the threat reportings you want. You can do the strategic analysis about airplanes. You can do the strategic analysis about car bombs, truck bombs, assassination attempts, fast boats, and everything else. And you can put all that out there to people. Unless somebody is thinking about the homeland from the perspective of buttoning it down to basically create a deterrence that may work, your assumption will be that the FBI and the CIA are going to be 100% flawless all the time, and it will never happen. Notwithstanding all the improvements we've made with your help, it's not going to happen. And I think one of the things that we've learned is
what an uplifting message, right? I mean, hey, by the way, we have a budget over $80 billion that's given to us by the House Appropriations Committee. And usually you're always begging for more, Mr. Tenet. You have a habit of also firing many case officers, grounds people. And that's coming from your own agency, people who worked in the counterterrorism unit. And that's because you're a 7th floor man. 7th floor meaning that these are the bureaucrats of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Tenet definitely is a bureaucrat as compared to someone like Kofor Black. Kofor Black is actually a guy who actually will get his, shoes dirty. Tenet's the type of guy who goes to these, $5,000 dinner plates in Washington, D.C., begging for money to wealthy donors, crying poor at the agency. We don't have enough money.
in hindsight, the country's mindset has to be changed fundamentally. No more sighs of relief. We're in this for a long time. We have to get about the business of protecting the country with the private sector, the chiefs of police, the state and locals now. Because the threat environment we find ourselves in today is as bad as it was last summer, the summer before 9/11. It is serious. They have reconstituted. They're coming after us. They want to execute attacks. You see it in Bali. You see it in Kuwait. They plan in multiple theaters of operation. They intend to strike this homeland again. And we better get about the business of putting the right structure in place as fast as we can.
I will come back to you in a minute on the coordination and communication with local law enforcement. Director Mueller.
Well, looking back at and seeing what our greatest vulnerability was in retrospect, it was the fact that we had not hardened our cockpits. And we had assumed that hijackers on a plane will want to get the plane to the ground. We, unlike the Israelis with El Al, did not harden our cockpits. And all of the warnings that we got probably would not have led us in that environment to take the step of requiring airlines to harden the cockpits to prevent hijackers from coming in and taking over planes and crashing them into buildings.
You had that intelligence, Mr. Mueller. Now, you weren't the director at the time. It was Louis Freeh. However, it's not a secret that there were operatives who wanted to hijack planes. That was going back to 1995. And I'm going to share a video with you regarding Philippines lead investigator Rodolfo Mendoza. And he basically had shared information through the interrogation of Abdul Hakim Murad, who basically was part of an international terrorist plot called Bajinka, where they wanted to bomb 12 planes leaving the United States and Asia over the Pacific and hijack one plane and crash into CIA Langley. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play that video for you and share it with you. And you can see Rodolfo Mendoza, he shared that intelligence with the FBI.
Philippine government during that time allowed the full cooperations with the United States insofar as international cooperations against terrorism. And I know that we have passed that information to our American counterparts. Important lessons,
Right.
I think,
And it
we
was
have
and
derived
that's
from
public document.
it could have
available to you.
possibly delayed it more because you cannot stop a fanatical group. Maybe you can delay their actions. Maybe before doing their actions, they have to be neutralized. What I mean is if there is really a serious initiative to investigate this information, what goes afterwards is possibly a delay or possibly neutralizing the people who are supposed to implement the plan.
Yeah, that's right. Listen, and like I said, it was no secret that they were going to hijack planes. And that's 1996, by the way. Okay, when we shared that information with the FBI, so there was no excuse here as to why we couldn't warn the FAA about taking the necessary precautionary measures to have better security on the planes, including cockpit security. But that's the FBI's fault.
That is that in retrospect, when you look back at it, you ask what could have been done to prevent this attack. That is the one thing that as a country, as an industry, that could have been done to protect this type of occurrence.
Whose responsibility would that have been?
Can I say something to you, sir?
You see, Tenet's interfering, and I'll tell you why, because it's the CIA. And I'll tell you in short order. The CIA was in charge of an operation regarding a house in Yemen, Sana'a, Yemen. And I've talked about this many times. It was an Al-Qaeda communications hub. And the reason how the CIA became in charge of the operation was that the NSA, and you can see the NSA director, Michael Hayden, sitting next to the left of Tenet, the NSA had a wiretap on bin Laden's satellite phone, and one number kept calling on the phone, and it was located in Sana'a, Yemen, and it was a house owned by a guy named Ahmed al-Hada, who is an associate of bin Laden from the Afghan Soviet war days. And this house became the communications hub for Al-Qaeda worldwide. One person in particular that used to visit this house because he was married to his daughter, Hoda al-Hada, was Khalid al-Mihdhar. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, he was one of the hijackers of Flight 77. And he married her. So he was the son-in-law to Ahmed al-Hada. The NSA informed the CIA about this house because they wanted to get photographs of the people that they were monitoring, so they could listen to the voice, but they didn't have a face to go with the voice. Now the CIA did take pictures, and they never shared that with the NSA, and the NSA never shared their signals intelligence with the CIA, and neither agency shared their information with the FBI.
Yes,
The thing is unless, Bob, excuse me,
And
unless
the reason why I see it, and the reason why Tenet interfered with Robert Mueller, because Mueller probably would have said it's the CIA's fault. It was their operation. They were the lead agency in charge. So that's why Tenet basically interfered. Let's play that again.
type of occurrence.
whose responsibility would that have been?
Tenet, as you now look at here, Tenet.
Can I say something to you, sir?
Yes,
The thing is unless, Bob, excuse me, unless the program is systematic, they watch all of this very carefully. It's not just about fixing one thing. You have to think about it from a systemic perspective. It's not just harden the cockpits. You have to look at the whole system. So if it's not being done simultaneously, the terrorist just sits back. If you look at how these people behaved, you understand how they've collected data against an open society for years. It's not just one thing or one system.
For the Bureau,
And not to mention that you knew about the structure of Al Qaeda, and that came from the testimony of Jamal al-Fadl, who is an Al Qaeda courier, financial courier, and he became an informant for the FBI and the CIA, and he was actually the first Al Qaeda defector, and he gave you the necessary data and information about how the Al Qaeda was structured. You did nothing with it.
from the perspective of the Bureau, the two, I think, critical changes necessary were one, to adopt a new way of looking at managing cases. The Bureau traditionally has run cases through Office of Origin. Each individual special agent in charge is in charge of the cases that arise in that particular field office or that division. And there can be discussion and tension as to who gets the Office of Origin. Well, New York did a terrific job as Office of Origin for UBL. But New York is one field office. When you're looking at international terrorism, it's important for us as an institution to have centralized all information relating to UBL, whether it comes from Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Maine, or Miami, or from Hamburg, Germany, or someplace else. Centralized, not only centralized information flow, but also centralized accountability for assuring that investigations, wherever they may pop up, have the required manpower to be addressed. And we as an institution have, over the years, placed the accountability in the field offices where on a national program where we face a national security threat, the accountability, in my mind, should be at headquarters. That is coupled with the necessity of having the information in a centralized database with sufficient number of analysts, and those analysts having the capability to generate the reports that an intelligence agency has traditionally done. We have not filled that void in the past. We have to do a better job of gathering our intelligence, analyzing that intelligence, and disseminating that intelligence. Those are the two critical items I believe that the Bureau has to address in order to prevent, or do the best we can to prevent another circumstance such as that would happen.
Well, isn't that interesting? Actually, there was a number of FBI agents over the years that came out and complained to you, Bob, about non-committal from their superiors. One of them was Harry Samet of the Minneapolis field office, Colleen Raleigh, Minneapolis field office, Robert Wright Jr., Chicago field office, Ken Williams, Arizona field office, New York, Mark Rossini, John Antisev, Frank Pellegrino. Some of these guys are whistleblowers that are generally ignored by the public, like Mark Rossini. These people had given their superiors enormous amounts of pertinent data, and the superiors basically either ignored it or didn't share it and didn't act on it. One such particular incident involved Colleen Raleigh writing a scathing report to you, Mr. Mueller, in regards to the FOIA request regarding a FISA warrant for Zacchaeus Moussaoui's laptop and his personal belongings. For those who are not aware, Zacchaeus Moussaoui is alleged to be the 20th hijacker. I just think he was one of many who were going to be on the second wave of the attacks. That's coming from Moussaoui's own testimony, and he wasn't tortured. And Rowley, basically, the FISA warrant wasn't allowed, and you couldn't get into Moussaoui's laptop. And Harry Samet complained to the radical fundamentalist unit in Minnesota, and that was headed by Bob Bowman and Dave Frasca. So they basically didn't allow for the FISA warrant to be authorized. Incidentally, after September 11th, then they got the FISA warrant and they opened Moussaoui's laptop. But by then it was too late. But you can see that there's a number of instances where there was reports, daily reports, and you didn't act on it. Their superiors of the FBI didn't act on it. Just didn't.
Which happened on September 11th.
Director,
Look. I'm not blaming just the FBI. There's more blame for the CIA and the NSA than the FBI. But I mean, there's enough blame to go around.
Tenet, there are a number of things that we saw in the 90s that would suggest that the likelihood of an attack was greater, and every several years that happened. But there's no doubt that you personally believed that we had reached a new level in December of '98 when you made a statement that we were declaring war on Al-Qaeda. From the time that you made that declaration, what specific things changed within the CIA to reflect your concern over an imminent attack?
Well, first of all, you actually had a strategic plan that you put in place about how to attack the target, whose plan was not only to collect more intelligence, but to get in the sanctuary and attack it. And
Yeah, this was actually Tenet's operation called the Plan, which was to try and build close intelligence bases or points of operation where CIA case officers would work with Arabs on the ground who were at odds with Al-Qaeda. And that would be through the Northern Alliance, who was fighting the Taliban at the time for control of the country in Afghanistan. Cofer Black wanted to get informants inside Al-Qaeda. And when he was named the counterterrorism chief, he was horrified at the fact that the CIA didn't try to get informants inside Al-Qaeda. And so George Tenet implemented the plan, which was to gather as much intelligence to build close sanctuaries next to these training camps and points where Al-Qaeda was staying in Afghanistan, and try to either rendition bin Laden or kill him.
gain as much intelligence as you possibly can. I mean, we've heard all these stories about, well, they didn't speak the languages, they couldn't get in the target. So number one, you have to have a plan. You have to hold.
Also, that's another good point that Tenet raises here. the CIA and the FBI didn't hire any Arab-speaking linguists in their respective agencies. Ali Soufan, the legendary counterterrorism FBI case officer in New York, basically complained to John O'Neill, his boss, and John O'Neill actually complained to his superiors, who basically hated John O'Neill and didn't care about his request to have more Arab speakers in the agency. And that just shows you their seriousness in fighting this war on terrorism.
Yourself accountable to the plan. You have to personally lead the execution of the plan. We put more people on it. We put as much money. We asked you for more money. We asked the administration for more money.
No, let's talk about money. Talking about money. Again, this goes back to the point I was raising about money. Now, this is, I'm going to share with you an article written by the Christian Science Monitor. This article was written in May 26, 2000. Top Secret CIA, its own budget, written by Justin Brown. The figures estimated between 29 billion to 30 billion for the year 2000 in a first step in making the intelligence agencies fall in line with the domestic process that they apply to other parts of the government. Now, the CIA is one of the agencies that received a large portion of this budget, which is through the Senate Appropriations Committee. You had enough money at your disposal. And as you could read here, after Good's crusade suffered a setback this week. However, when the House of Representatives backed CIA Director George Tenet and rejected a measure to disclose the agency's 1990 budget, and on Wednesday, the CIA informed after Good that his request for the 2000 budget under the Freedom of Information Act had been rejected. Now, there's a reason why, because the CIA not only has to account for the Senate Appropriations Committee budget, but also the budget that they get through black operations, through drug money. That's where they get most of their money from. And they would have to account for that. And they don't want to account for that because if they do, they would be in big trouble. So they can't. They can't show it to the public.
We created a worldwide coalition of partners who we relentlessly badgered to say, you have to be in this fight with us to augment our numbers. And the other thing is you have to remember, it's not just what goes on at headquarters in the center, it's what's going on in the field and trying to grow more case officers while you're fighting this, trying to grow more analysts that you surge over.
Well, guess what? If you didn't fire over 600 analysts, that's coming from one of your counterterrorism officers, Gary Bernstein, who is in charge of one of the biggest CIA operations, probably the biggest ever in the agency history, called Jawbreaker, which was a mounted offense against Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda with the help of the Eastern and Northern Alliance and Hamid Karzai in their fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Tora Bora in Afghanistan, and basically disseminated both groups, but bin Laden escaped. But if you didn't fire over 600, case agents, those who worked in the field, you wouldn't be having this problem or complaining, which you're doing right now.
Try to resurrect a clandestine human capability that, quite frankly, everybody had ignored.
And that's, another thing too, let me share something with you. And I'm not, just so you know, I'm not, putting words in Bernstein's mouth. I'll share a Wikipedia page. It's Gary Bernstein's Wikipedia page. And as you can see from here, and let me shorten the screen. Bernstein went to Afghanistan in March of 2000 as a part of the CIA team that planned on capturing senior Al-Qaeda leader. And Bernstein writes, though leaders at the CIA, particularly Covert Black and Henry Crumpton, had shown a willingness to plan and execute risky missions, top U.S. government leadership, including Bill Clinton and CIA Director George Tenet, were unprepared to take the increased risks. That's because Bernstein really, he didn't think of you very highly. And I guess the reason why was because you were not uh, in favor of, well, you were too bureaucratic. That's the problem.
And we were in terrible shape. So the whole focus is build your infrastructure and get after this problem and bring as many people to the fight as you possibly can around the world to augment your own numbers and keep your eye focused on the target and figure out what the right balance is between the people at headquarters and the people in the field, to get the tools out there where the operations are run, where the tracing needs to be done, and the technical operations. And all I can tell you is if you see the pace of operations that we are sustaining today, it's because the foundation was built, the plan was in place, and the dollars that have shown up have made an enormous difference in terms of flexibility. What we still don't have are enough people. So we're going to keep robbing people. We have 900 people in counterterrorism center today. It's probably not enough. You got hundreds more sitting overseas working this target almost exclusively. And what we need to keep calibrating is how much more can we do to do everything we know how to do to stop the next attack.
You know, that's the funny thing about the CIA, right? You have bureaucrats and then you have the real people, the ones on the ground, right? The bureaucrats are always complaining about understaffing. We didn't have enough money. We didn't have enough manpower to disseminate the information. Well, Tenet, I mean, like, you know, you keep complaining about money and staffing, and every year you do this. I mean, throughout the mid 90s, this was the echoing complaint by the CIA. But you're an agency that basically has an enormous amount of sociopaths in it and ego-driven individuals. So the problem stems from the seventh floor, if you will, the bureaucrats. If you weren't so jealous of your case officers in counterterrorism, you know, the real people like Gary Schroen or Gary Bernstein, Cofer Black, and those types, you probably would have had, you wouldn't be having the problem that you had now with Al Qaeda at this point.
Director Mueller, in the 90s, we had the World Trade Center bombing. In 93, we had the threat of airline use for attacks that came out of the trials in 95. We had the threats on the New York tunnels in 95, and I think both you and Director Tenet have alluded to others. At an earlier hearing, Dale Watson, the head of CT at the FBI, said prior to 9/11, there was a 98% likelihood that the attack would be abroad. Given the facts just covered and the targets being domestic, what process do you understand that the FBI went through to come to a conclusion that there was only a 2% likelihood that an attack would happen domestically here in the United States?
I'm not actually certain as to how Dale came to the 2%. I do believe, and I have heard, not being myself familiar with it or familiar with the warnings that were coming out during the summer leading up to September 11th. And my understanding, and I think George can talk to it perhaps more than I, most of those or many of those warnings related to attacks overseas. And that may have.
Well, I guess you're not referring to the CIA presidential brief, which those in the know would know by the title Bin Laden to attack inside the United States, which was a CIA cable given to President George Bush regarding information that that was collected by the testimony of the interrogation of Ahmed Rassam of the Millennium Plot regarding the want to attack the United States inside the country. It was a key, it was a, I think it was, the month was, I want to say June of 2001. Or was it April? April, one of those months. But that was given to the president by a briefer. Bin Laden to attack inside the United States. And it showed that his wish was to hijack airplanes and crash them in US targets. Wow.
Skewed the analysis to believe that because we're getting these warnings in, they're talking about attacks overseas. There's a less of a likelihood that'll be in the United States.
Well, I think even Director Tenet said earlier, one of the biggest mistakes was here. We caught somebody crossing the border and we didn't ask enough questions or suspect what else might be there that was targeted here. We had already had example after example after example of domestic targets. What
Funny thing is, by about this time too, in the year 2000, you had foreign intelligence already monitoring the operatives involved with 9/11 inside the United States, Israeli and Saudi intelligence, which was completely, it was, nobody was aware of this, not the FBI, not the State Department. But who told them to monitor these people, right? Somebody had to warn them. Why were they particularly following, say, the Hamburg cell on the East Coast, right? That was through the Israeli moving front companies, like Urban Moving Systems. They were monitoring Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and Ziad Jarrah. Out west in California, the Saudi agents, the GID, Omar al-Bayoumi, Osama Basnan, who were giving money to Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi and Hani Hanjour, Fahad al-Thumeri, and some money was actually coming from the bank account of Haifa bin Faisal, who's the wife of former Saudi U.S. Ambassador Bandar bin Sultan, just a close friend to the Bush family.
whether the attacks were thwarted or not. And I guess my question is more, what do we currently do within the FBI to analyze what the domestic threat is?
Well, there are a number of levels, and it's not, I would reiterate, it's not just the FBI, because part of one of the, I think, valid considerations or concerns are over the years is that we have treated our intelligence and law enforcement on the one hand, separate from our foreign intelligence. In other words, we have a CIA that looks overseas, we have the FBI that looks within the United States. And for a long time that worked where you didn't have an issue such as counterterrorism, which floods across borders. And so when we look at the threat against the United States now, we take into account issues such as the bombing in Bali. That is significant with regard to the threat within the United States. We did not always do that, I don't believe. Apart from that, we look at the vulnerabilities within the United States. We look at the various investigations, both preliminary and full, that we have around the United States to determine whether or not there is any threat information that comes out. Where we have an issue that comes to the fore, where we believe that there needs to be additional analytical research given to it, we now give it that analytical research. If you can recall, back in the wake of September 11th, there was some belief that there was the possibility of using crop dusters. And
yeah, that's right. Actually, Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and an unknown individual went to, I think it was Oklahoma, where they tried to rent out a crop duster. Now, that would only imply that the crop duster was used to try and spread some sort of chemical agent into a city. Now, that's one thing that would probably be is valid, actually, because Bin Laden had always talked about this, to try and poison a big city using ricin or anthrax or a nerve agent.
And that had come out in a couple of threat warnings. And When that happens, we pull everything relating to crop dusters. We alert.
And actually, that was in Zacharias Moussaoui's laptop, actually. There was a couple of search engines that he used to look for crop duster rentals.
Each of our field offices to go out and coordinate with each of the fields. When something like that comes along, we utilize both our people in the field as well as our analytical capability to put together a picture of what the actual threat is and integrate it with what George has from his people overseas.
Let me stop you there. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time, and there are a couple other areas I need to try to cover. Director Mueller, we had the chief of police from Baltimore testify at one of the open hearings. And I think both you and Director Tenet, as well as
It's funny because the chief of police of Baltimore, I forgot his name, but he was actually one of the primary actors in the show The Wire, which is awesome. That's the second best show I've ever seen.
most members on this inquiry would say that we had a breakdown of communication and an inability to disseminate information, and that contributed in some way, shape, or form to September the 11th.
Sure.
This chief of police said, I thought after September the 11th, things would change and the communication between federal and local would get better. And the fact was he came to testify to say that it hadn't. Is that a surprise to you? And what is being done to try to open up that line?
Well, I did indicate in my opening statement that there were selected witnesses called to testify. I don't believe that this particular witness is representative of the feeling in the field. Does his testimony surprise me?
Wow, what a load.
I would say probably not. But I will tell you, every time that I have, and I've reached out to this particular individual in the past and asked him to call me if there are any concerns. Whenever I've seen either publicly or in testimony before this committee or another committee that there is a police chief who is not getting what he or she wants, I have picked up the phone and called them to try to address those concerns.
But it is the intent of the FBI to open those lines of communication.
And let me finish by saying that I got and I don't know whether I'm not certain when this testimony was. It was probably in September, but it's a letter from William Burr, the president of the IACP. And the letter praises us for the changes we've made to address this particular problem. And I'll just read one paragraph. It is my belief that the steps you have taken have been very responsive to these concerns and clearly demonstrate the FBI's commitment to enhancing its relationship with state and local law enforcement in improving our ability to combat not only terrorism, but all crime. I was at the IACP 2 weeks ago. I talked to the hierarchy, and I believe that they are supportive. There are isolated individuals throughout the United States who do not believe we're doing enough, and there are areas where we still have a ways to go, getting clearances for chiefs of police. Exchange of information all the way down and getting it back up. We have a number of joint terrorism task forces that are working exceptionally well around the country. And I think if you went to 9 out of 10 or 99 out of 100 or 55 out of 56, you will find the state and locals.
Yeah, I'll give you a start. Fire the bureaucrats. That's for one. You know, it's hard because when you apply for an intelligence service, right, or even through a local law enforcement, you start off as a cop and you want to fight justice and you want to bring justice to the public and all that stuff, right? And then you're promoted to sergeant. And then that all of a sudden now you got to deal with the problems of the flatfoots, you know, the menial problems, and they all become enormous. There's too much. You're not getting enough funding. You're not getting enough support from the people upstairs, you know, your superiors. And then you become a lieutenant. And then all of a sudden now you start feeling a little bit distant from where you once were. And you like your position because you're meeting powerful people. You're meeting people of influence. And then you become chief. And all of a sudden, where you once were becomes a distant memory. You're not interested in justice anymore. You're interested in profit, in prestige.
Police, very supportive of the relationship. There'll always be one, there'll always be two, and we try to address them as they come along. But
Director Tenet.
Well, I think here's a place that I think that we can be very helpful.
Well, Tenet, you're the biggest villain of all in the room about sharing intelligence. Meanwhile, I'll give you an example. There was a cable that came in, Alex Station, which was the Bin Laden issue station, a virtual station that employed in other agencies to collect data about Al Qaeda and Bin Laden, and to share it within the agency. They weren't allowed to share it outside the agency. But there was a cable that came in about Khalid al-Mihdhar and his passport. And on his passport was a US visa. He was heading to the United States. And the CIA basically got this information because a CIA agent broke into a hotel room in Dubai where Khalid al-Mihdhar was staying. And they photographed his passport. It went to Alex Station. The first person that read it was Doug Mueller of the FBI and a friend to Mark Rossini. He came out of New York City, just like Mark Rossini, John O'Neill's crew, I-49. Doug Mueller read the cable and tried to write a draft cable warning FBI headquarters about Khalid al-Mihdhar coming to the United States. Here's a guy who is suspected of being behind the USS Cole bombing in Yemen in 2000. However, he had to get the approval of the CIA case officer in charge of the Yemen hub, Michelle Ann Casey, and she had to get the approval of the deputy chief of Alex Station, that's Tom Wilshire, and the head chief of Alex Station is Richard Blee. It was Michael Shore at first, then it was Richard Blee. So the cable was then read, the draft cable from Doug Miller was read by Michelle Ann Casey, who brought it to Tom Wilshire, and Tom Wilshire told Michelle Ann Casey on the cable, please hold off per Wilshire. The cable was never sent. Mark Rossini, seeing that the cable was never sent, went to Michelle Ann Casey and asked, what's up? Why is the cable not being shared with the FBI? And she says, it's not the FBI's jurisdiction, meaning that the information that was coming abroad is the CIA's jurisdiction. It's not information that was coming from the United States. And the CIA is in charge of all things outside the United States. And she told them, we'll let you know when it becomes an FBI matter. You are not to share this information with the FBI. Rossini kept complaining. And one CIA case officer, Alfreda Ampikowski, basically told Mark Rossini in those uncertain terms, if you share this information with anyone outside of Alex Station, we'll have you arrested. Basically threatening Mark Rossini. That information, and Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi entered the United States allegedly on January 15th of 2000. And they were here for 16 months. This information was never shared with the FBI or the State Department until August of 2001 during a National Security briefing between Condoleezza Rice, Richard Clarke, and the heads of the agencies, in which Richard Blee says that, well, here's, we think there are two hijackers, there are two Al Qaeda operatives inside the United States. And they only told them their first names. The FBI, they found out their names anyway. And the FBI, the New York office, relegated the task to one agent who was new. He was a week in, I forgot his name, to look for Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. And they didn't know where they were. They had no idea where they were at this time. Imagine trying to find the names of Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi and running around the country in mid-August. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. So yes, the CIA is a huge problem when it comes to not sharing information. That was just one incident. I can give you a number of different incidents where they could have shared the information regarding a number of these hijackers. And like I said, there were two foreign agencies inside the United States, Israel and Saudi Arabia. They had agents who were monitoring these subjects who later would go on to hijack the airplanes, which was used on September 11th. And they never told the FBI or the State Department.
To Bob and the FBI. I mean, look, let me just put it in a couple of ways. There's nothing ambiguous about the strategic threat or the targets they're thinking about or what they're looking at. It's not ambiguous anymore. Who are the most important people in the battle? The most important people in the battle are the people on the street in localities around the country who actually know their street, actually know their neighborhood, actually know people who are coming in and out of those neighborhoods. And what we need to do is basically, if you build a system that basically is based on the old rules, then we're not going to meet their needs. We need to give them products that are content rich, that reveal nothing about sources and methods and methodologies, that allows them to understand what we're looking at so they can be attuned to what they need to do to help us. And it's critical for this to succeed. And some of the things we're doing together, there's a lot of strategic analysis, target-based analysis, all kinds of papers we've written, sharing with the FBI. We need to bring those people in.
You never shared anything with the FBI.
Sit them down, educate them, and then provide training to their people about how to think about this target. And they got a lot of other things to do. The smartest guy is the cop on the beat, because he or she sees things that nobody in a Washington bureaucracy is ever going to see.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you have been extremely generous with the time. I would only ask as I end my questioning, I wanted to get into the communications between CIA and FBI and the FAA. We have tried for some weeks now to get from both agencies the specific communications that took place in the calendar year of 2001 from either of the agencies, specifically to the FAA or to airlines. And if you two directors would help us at pushing that a little bit within your own organizations so that we can look at those documents and understand better what was shared with the FAA and or airlines, it would be helpful.
But we do know, we will do that for the record, Mr. Chairman. We do know the other thing you need to be aware of is there was in this time period and continues to be a very active counterterrorism group down at the NSC who convened all the stakeholders, review the bidding, and in part, I think there were 2 advisories issued last summer. I mean, there was nothing specific, although there was a heightened period of alertness. And the result was 2 advisories, but we didn't have a specific to help them. And I think that we have FAA representatives in our center, and we'll come back to you because this is where Homeland Security is really going to make a difference.
Yeah, and it didn't. And, that's the problem with people like George Tenet, Director Mueller, and other heads of these agencies, even Michael Hayden, who barely got a question during the Joint House inquiry, and yet the NSA, the one agency hardly anyone knows about regarding 9/11, they had the most data of all regarding the hijackers. And according to former senior executive Thomas Drake, he said that the NSA had collected so much data regarding the phone calls, regarding the emails and text messages, that they could have stopped 9/11 altogether if it was shared with the CIA or the FBI. And they never shared it. There's a whole lot of hypocrisy stated in this one video. And that's just one panel member asking questions. I'll end it there.